Hi, I'm John Mitchell, Mayor of New Bedford, and I'm standing here on the third floor of our main public library to introduce to you a really exciting exhibit about an important aspect of our city's history. And specifically, this is an exhibit about the contributions that Cape Verdeans have made in our nation's armed forces. It's a really exciting exhibit that has been orchestrated by Ron Barboza, who is a photographer, but also has an eye for important events in history, especially Cape Verdean history. I think this is something, and I'll just say this up front, I think this is something that every kid in our city should come and see. The Cape Verdeans of New Bedford have been contributing heroically to our nation's armed forces right from the start, all the way back to the American Revolution. And I think what this exhibit does, and you'll see plenty of it in a moment, is really bring to life some of the folks, many of whom are still with us today, and their exploits in wars going back to the Second World War, all the way up to the battles in Afghanistan today. So I want to introduce Ron Barboza to you, who can, what I'd like for you to do, Ron, is tell us a little bit about how the idea came to you, and then we'll talk about a few of the photos that are right behind us.
Well, thank you. I want to thank the city, and I also want to thank the library for this opportunity in hosting this exhibit here. I think it's a beautiful location to have the exhibit. It gives access to the Cape Verdean community, which is not far from here, and hopefully it'll bring other communities here to see the exhibit as well. I've been studying Cape Verde for almost 50 years now, and I've studied a lot of different aspects about Cape Verde. The military is of particular interest. Two of my brothers, as well as my father, served in the military. My father was in the Second World War. I try to do as much studying as I can, and I wanted to honor all the Cape Verdeans that have ever served. With the research that I've done, I found Cape Verdeans in the Revolutionary War, in every war that America has fought in. During the Civil War, we've had a list of at least 100 Cape Verdeans, mainly from New Bedford, most of them in the Navy, and some in the 54th Regiment as well. The First World War, I have a list of Cape Verdeans that we've been able to uncover, as well as all of the wars, including Afghanistan, which we'll go through in a little while. I want to say that when I was a young man, the Cape Verdean population was something around 17% of the city population. So there was about 17,000 Cape Verdeans when I was young. Today, there's an estimate of at least 500,000 Cape Verdeans that live throughout America. But almost all of us have our roots from New Bedford. This is our Ellis Island. 90% of the Cape Verdeans that came to America in those early years, between 1860 and 1920, 1922, came to the city of New Bedford. My four grandparents were all born in Cape Verde. They came 1899 through 1919, and their children, my mother and father, and all of my relatives came to the city at one time. My father was actually born in Falmouth. He was one of 14 children, and 5 of his brothers served in the Second World War. And I'll explain and show his photograph in a little while. But our story is sort of a unique story that hasn't been written down. And I feel that it's an obligation of mine to begin to write our history. And not only have I done interviews over the last 50 years, but before they had videotape, I was doing audio tape and reel-to-reel and different things. I got some of the stories down, but there's still a lot of stories to be told, and once our history goes, it's gone forever. Some of the things that were not recorded, some of the stories about the transatlantic voyage from the islands to America, it's a story that needs to be told. And the story about the soldiers, about their personal experiences, some of them facing discrimination, hard times within the service itself. So that's what this exhibit is about. I want to bring honor to all those that have served and that are still serving.
I think you're doing an enormous service, not just to the Cape Verdean community, but also to the entire city, and codifying the story, right? Putting it in place for generations to come to see. And as I said, I think every kid in our city, every kid in Greater New Bedford should come see this. And what's always been remarkable to me is, you know, the level of willingness of Cape Verdeans to serve in the armed forces. I mean, just in sheer percentage terms, has been extraordinarily high over generations, and it is a source of pride, not just for Cape Verdeans, but also for the whole city, which is, and it's a remarkable part of New Bedford's history as well. I've got a few questions here just about this panel, maybe just to kick us off, and then you can walk our audience through more. But there are three people in this particular case, which is mostly World War II, that I wanted to highlight. The first is Hank DeGrace, who's still with us. And Hank, I remember maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, maybe longer, reading about Hank in a history book about his exploits in the 101st Airborne Division in Europe. And could you tell us a little bit about that?
The thing about Hank is that he has some sons. And there's 3 generations that fought, that were soldiers in the 101 paratroopers. He was a recipient of 2 Purple Hearts. He was in the Battle of the Bulge, where he was injured. And his relatives go way back. I don't know if many people will know about Daddy Grace, who was an evangelist. Well, he's related to Daddy Grace. Hank now lives in Fairhaven. I have to look up his age, but it's between 94 and 96 years old. I interviewed him just about a month ago for the 3rd time, and he still has his faculties. He's still able to tell me his story.
Yeah.
And that's what's so important about trying to capture the stories, especially of the World War II veterans, because every day someone from the Second World War passes away. We did a program at the Whaler Museum, as I mentioned before, a couple of years ago, and we had 43 individuals still alive from the Second World War. To this day, there's half of them are gone. But some of these guys, there are 5 here that are still alive from the Second World War. They're all in their 90s, and Judge Layton.
Well, let's talk about Judge Layton. So Judge Layton is an inspiration for everybody, as someone who, in different facets of his life, as a soldier, as an officer, as a champion of civil rights nationally, and as somebody who served with great distinction on the state bench as a state judge in Illinois, as well as a federal judge in Illinois, and someone who swore me in as mayor. I had him in my second term. I asked him if he would swear me in, and he did it at the age of the ripe old age of 102, and that was a couple of years ago. But it was great to be in his presence because he's such an impressive guy. But tell us a little bit about his wartime experience.
He's a remarkable guy. I want to say that Judge Layton will be 105 this year, on October the 22nd. He never graduated from high school. He wrote an essay for a contest for a Cape Verdean scholarship. He ended up winning, him and a guy named Peters from the Cape, from Falmouth. And when they found out that he never graduated from high school, they said, "We can't give you the money." This was Lawyer Gomes, who the school is named after, was on that committee. So Lawyer Gomes contacted Howard University and said, "We have a young man here that has got a scholarship, but he never graduated from high school." So he made an agreement with Howard about admitting Judge Layton to the school on a trial basis. And if he did well, he would get the rest of the money, which was $250. So he got half of it the first semester. Well, he ends up graduating number one in his class. He ends up going to the Second World War after graduating from Howard, and then going to Harvard, becoming the first Cape Verdean to graduate from Harvard with a law degree. And then becomes a federal court judge in 1976.
And he argued cases before the Supreme Court, and everybody knows he's a brilliant guy.
He is. And
But he was also in the Army as well. He spent time in the Army in the Second World War.
He was in the Pacific Theater, and he was in combat. And he told me the story where he used to peel potatoes in a restaurant. I think it was on a railroad, and in those days, they had 50-pound sacks, and if the potatoes weighed like 46 pounds or 48 pounds, they would throw a rock in there to make it the even weight of 50. And there was this white rock in one of the bags. He kept it as a lucky piece, and he carried it all through the service. And he told me that this was his lucky charm, and that because during battle, there was a guy beside him that ended up getting killed. And he feels that his lucky piece, this rock, which he had put in lucite, and he put it on his desk when he was a judge. But he was in a number of islands in the Pacific. He was a rank of captain, and he had a college education at the time. He was very good friends with Thurgood Marshall. They fought a lot of civil rights cases together. Some very important civil rights cases that are nationally known in the 50s.
A true American hero by any definition, for sure. So I want to talk about your father a little bit. His wartime history. Can you share that with everybody?
Sure. My father was born in Falmouth. He lived in New Bedford. That's where he met my mother. Actually, he worked on a boat that went from Providence to New York, and my mother was coming back to New Bedford because her grandmother had passed away. My father was a Fuller Brush man. A lot of people know him through the Fuller Brush. He was a Fuller Brush man for 55 years, and he had 8 sons. I'm the second son. We all sold Fuller Brush at one time or another. During the Second World War, he enlisted, and he was in an all-black unit. He went to Fort Benning, Georgia. He was overseas, part of D-Day, not the actual battle, but they were used. A lot of the black troops were used in different capacities. Some of them as cleanup, some of them as transportation. Frank Grace here was on the Red Ball Express with General Patton. Mm-hmm. But for me, my father wasn't in the battles itself, but it's not because he didn't want to be, as some of the other Cape Verdeans as well. But it's just the way the service was at that time. That was segregated, and he told me stories about problems that they had in the service. So they're all heroes in my eyes.
Absolutely. So you're going to take us on a tour of the other exhibits, and I think what people will see, we'll see some familiar faces. I see Peter Brito right there, and Billy DeCarmo, and there'll be lots of others. And I think it would be interesting for lots of people in the community to see people they know and their military history that they might not know too much about, which I think is another cool aspect of this exhibit. But I just want to thank you on behalf of the city for spending the time, bringing this forward, and creating an opportunity for especially kids to learn, but all of us to be inspired. So thank you.
Thank you, man.
Thanks, Ron.
I want to mention about Cape Verdeans in the Revolutionary War. I've been doing research on that, but I probably have 10 or 12 names of Revolutionary War fighters. And in many cases, they were named as Black Portuguese, or some of them took the name Manuel Cub de Verde. This is how we were able to identify them in the Civil War. And some of the Cape Verdeans in those years, because of their accent and their pronunciation, when you look at the records, their names are a bit different. Like the name Pius or Pires, in Creole you say Pires. So it was named Pius. So some of those soldiers that were Pius from Cape Verde were actually Pius. I don't, the camera was invented in, I'm not even remember exactly the year, but we don't have any photographs of the Revolutionary War. And I have yet to find a photograph of Cape Verdeans in the Civil War. I know there's some black troops, there are some Navy shots of a bunch of soldiers of color in the Civil War. So I have yet to identify any of them, but I believe they were in that bunch because there were at least 100 naval Cape Verdeans that were in the Navy. And they probably signed in New Bedford, many of them. They were on whaling ships because some of the whaling ships were turned into battleships during the war. So really this photographic exhibit, the first photographs we have, at least at this point, is the First World War. And these two shelves are photographs of Cape Verdeans in the First World War. Now, some of these photographs I copied 35, 40 years ago when I would go to people's homes and take their scrapbooks, take the photograph and tape it to the wall, and then take a photograph of it because we didn't have computers or scans back then. So, for example, this one here, Henry Forts, he was in the First World War. He had two brothers, and he, in the 1940s, he owned a fishing boat. He was the first Cape Verdean to own a fishing boat, him and his brother. The man in the middle, Joseph Pinto, I just found out about a month ago that he's a veteran of the First World War, and his daughter, or his granddaughter, told me that when he passed, he got buried. He wanted to get buried in his uniform, which is the one that he has on there. This unknown Cape Verdean from the First World War is, I found out last week what his name is, because I had copied the photograph, didn't know who I copied it from, but his name is Antonio or Antonin Duat. His nephew came up here to the exhibit, saw the photo and said, "That's my uncle." And Father Duvall from the First World War, he was a priest at St. John the Baptist Church on County Street. He was born in the Azores, but his mother, I forget if it's his mother or his father, one of them was born in the Cape Verde Islands. And he administered to both Germans and Americans in what they call no man's land, where they had the gas in the First World War, and he was gassed. He came back from the war. He got the highest medal from the French government. And about 2 years after he came back, he died, and they had a big parade in New Bedford honoring him. Some of the bottom shelf here is to do with the Second World War, as well as over here in the middle. And let me just name the individuals. Hank de Grace, this is my father, Anthony Barboza. Joseph Silva, he is the second oldest Cape Verdean veteran that I know. Judge Layton is the oldest, and he just turned 99 as of April the 12th. He was in the Army, and he was one of the early enlistments from the city of New Bedford. Raymond Medina, who lives in the North End now, he's about 94. He was in the Army, and he was in the Asiatic Theater. He was in the Philippines. Agno Rose, he's still alive. I believe he's 92, and he was one of the few black Marines in the Second World War. Joseph Montero was, I believe, in the Battle of the Bulge, as well as Judge Layton that we talked about earlier, and Frank Grace, was on the Red Ball Express, which was the fast track for General Patton. So he was involved in that. This next group of photographs deals with Korea. And in the middle is President Obama and Herculino Dias, who was born in Connecticut. He was in many battles, and he was the last all-black paratrooper outfit in the service. And he was honored by President Obama along with some of the other team members. Bill DeCamo and his brother Charlie were both in Korea, and Bill was in combat. He was in a bomber, and he flew from K2 base in Korea. Stephen Baptiste was a paratrooper. This was after the Korean War, and they called them black hats, and you had to be really a good jumper to be considered to get an instructor to get a black hat. And he lives in Connecticut. He was a police officer after the service, and he owns a restaurant there. Butch Silver, who served in Korea, lived in New Bedford and Connecticut. Peter Brittle, who is well known in the city. He's developed some basketball leagues, and his sons were students of mine. His son was a student of mine, and his daughter ran track for me when I was coaching. On the bottom shelf is my wife's grandfather and her father and uncle, Korea and the Second World War. Stanley Barbosa in Korea, who had a grenade explode in his foxhole and got a Purple Heart, was in combat, I think at age 17. I think he forged and went into the service early. And Jorge Lima, one of the Tuskegee Airmen, there's a couple of Cape Verdeans that were Tuskegee Airmen, and he was a photographer on the base. Okay, this particular case deals with Vietnam and Afghanistan. And there's some crossovers because in Iraq and Afghanistan you had several wars. You had the Desert Storm and Iraqi freedom and so forth. But you begin to see a lot of Cape Verdean women that have joined the services. And some of them are here. But I want to go through Vietnam first. Anton Lopes, who was involved in a lot of combat in Vietnam, and he was highly decorated. Kenneth Gilbert, who was in Vietnam as well, and you can see the uniform, the Marines, with lots of medals on his chest. And Peter Cachado, who I had a chance to interview and told me about some of the battles in Vietnam and some of the things that went on in Vietnam. Archie Ribeiro, who was sort of in between Vietnam and Korea. He was in the service at that time. And this is Anthony Richards. They call him Tabby. And he was in Vietnam and Iraq. He was in the service, I think, over 29 years. And I have a lot of his medals in another case over there. Wayne Ramus, who was in the Navy in Vietnam as well. Virginia Senna, who was enduring Iraq. Tootsie or Irving Russell, who was in Vietnam, who was in the thick of a lot of things in Vietnam. Paul Souza, who was in Iraq. I believe it's Iraq. And then we go over to the last panel here. Kiddis Lobo, who was in Afghanistan. This middle photo is Gary Brittle, who's the highest ranking Cape Verdean in history up to this point. He's a brigadier general. He's originally from the Cape area. I think it's Hyannis, but I have to check on the exact city he's from. And Colonel Pedro Almeida, who was a student of mine. I used to teach at New Bedford High. I taught there for 35 years, but he was one of the students. Sean Montero flew 125 missions in Afghanistan and Iraq as well. Gary Correa, to my knowledge, may have been the first Cape Verdean pilot, and he flew many missions in Kuwait as well as Iraq. He was a colonel, a lieutenant colonel. Christina Pat, to my knowledge, is the first Cape Verdean woman to graduate from West Point. Helena Almeida, which is Pedro's sister, she ran track for me when she was in junior high school. And she was in the Marines, and she has a daughter that's in the Marines now. Jay elopes in Iraq, and this is Helena's daughter, Enos, who was in Iraq, or Afghanistan, I should say. I've been researching Cape Verdean soldiers for years, but I want to continue to do this. So anyone that can help in any way, if you can have a database of the names of Cape Verdeans that have served in the armed services. I know I don't have everybody. I would like to add names to it. I'd like to add photographs. If you're able to contact me, I can give you my email. It's ronbarboza@yahoo.com. And if you can send photographs that I can scan, I can include those in the collection that I have, because I'm hoping to do a book about Cape Verdean soldiers. So, and any stories that you might have. There's an article that was done in the Boston Globe about a year or two ago about 6 brothers who served in the Second World War. And one of the brothers left a diary that he talked about going into the Second World War, and when he goes overseas, he's initiated with fire right away in a battle. And he talks about this in his diary. I have a diary of a Second World War soldier that from when he enlists until when he's discharged. Some of those things are part of our history that I would like to preserve. So anything that you can contribute to this process of documenting Cape Verdeans in the service would be greatly appreciated. There's a long photograph here that has a battalion. I think it's a battalion. But those types of things from the Second World War would be something that I would be interested in. I want to mention Manuel Figueiredo. He is 97, I believe. He's in great shape today. He told me when I met him, when I talked to him a couple of years ago when I did another program, that he met my father in Luxembourg. They were in Belgium and Luxembourg during the Second World War, and they had a chance to say hello to one another during the war. Teddy Ramos, the next photo, was in Anzio, where they had the big guns. The Germans had these guns in a cave, and they would take them out, and so he was there. John Soares was in the Battle of the Bulge. He was in the cavalry. John Costa, who lives in Freetown now, he was a young sailor at the time of the Second World War. And Pedro Cruz was at Keenan Island, where the Enola Gray refueled before it went to drop the bomb on Nagasaki, the atomic bomb. He was stationed there. So this is just part of the collection. I want to thank the library again, and I want to thank Cable Access for taping this program. I hope that some people or other people that haven't seen the exhibit will come, and I hope this will inspire them. I want to pay honor to all those who have served, and I thank you for your service.